And Jen's going to do the opening song. Hear now our second scripture reading from Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You'd better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." This is the word of God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Melanie. Being that parable, we've heard this parable before. We've talked about it before. I don't know if you remember. The last time that we did, I said, I think this parable at its heart is a story about waiting. Ha 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 ha. What a week for a story about waiting. Waiting and waiting for election results, for mailed-in votes to get counted, fitting for a time when we will be waiting and waiting for recounts and contested votes, fitting while we watch our COVID infection numbers go up and up and up without a sense really of when this all will end. This parable is from Matthew 25. It's a chapter of the Bible with 3 parables in it, and we talk about them a lot. There's the parable of the talents, you know that one, right? Where the one servant is so afraid of losing what he's been entrusted that he buries it in the ground. And then there comes the story of the sheep and the goats. I think you probably know that one too, where Jesus tells of a time when nations will be gathered together and then divided as sheep or goats based on how they have shown love for each other and for the least of these. But before these two more well-known parables comes this parable of the foolish bridesmaids. I'm starting a one-woman campaign to change it to the parable of the late bridegroom, but we can talk about that later. What starts Jesus off on these parables is taking place earlier in Matthew 24, verse 3. Jesus had just finished telling the disciples how the temple, which seemed so big and so strong and so indestructible, would one day be destroyed, which to them could only mean the end of the world. And they ask him, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" A reasonable question. And Jesus answers, of course, with no date, no time. Instead, he tells them a series of stories. Jesus told parables often when he could have just given a straight, simple answer, because parables have the power to make us think, to provoke us, to prompt questions that we might never have thought of before. Now, we often mistake this story for an allegory when we read it. We do that a lot with parables, right? We make God the bridegroom. We make ourselves the bridesmaids. The wedding banquet is heaven. And what we do when we do that is hear a real clear threat. Better be ready. Better stay awake, because if you don't, if you're not ready when the bridegroom arrives, you won't make it into heaven. Okay, but it's a parable, right? The bridegroom is not necessarily a symbol of God, the foolish bridesmaid of us. When we read a parable, when we read this story as a parable, I wonder what stands out, what provokes you, what makes you angry, what makes you wonder. Those are the questions the parable wants us to ask. So let's think about it again. 10 bridesmaids wait for a bridegroom. This is an ancient Near Eastern tradition in which the groom would come to the bride's home, where she and her bridesmaids and her family would all be waiting, and they would join him in his party, and they'd all journey together to his family home to celebrate the marriage. Only this time something is wrong. The bridegroom is late. So late, in fact, that the bridesmaids begin to fall asleep. It's not until after midnight that somebody finally spots him, and they all stretch and yawn and get up to go with him and join the party. Except, whoops, it's so late that half of the bridesmaids, the foolish ones, have run out of the oil for their lamps. The other 5 bridesmaids, the wise ones, even though they have extra oil for their lamps, tell the foolish bridesmaids, "There's not going to be enough for you and for us." And so they send them off, 5 young women alone in the middle of the night to buy oil. From what, like the 7-Eleven? I don't get it. Meanwhile, the wise bridesmaids and all of their oil walk off with the bridegroom to the wedding party and shut the door behind them. When the rest of the bridesmaids finally make it there, late, the bridegroom refuses to acknowledge them, and they're left outside the closed door of the party, alone in the middle of the night. Now, Jesus finishes the parable by saying, "Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." I think the reason we clamp on to the detail about the lamps and who was ready when we hear this story is that Jesus' ending doesn't really make any sense. I mean, they all fell asleep, the foolish bridesmaids and the wise ones. And if they had been awake the whole time, I mean, maybe they all would have run out of oil. What exactly is Jesus trying to get at here? This week's election, I don't know if you knew that was going on, as every election does, revealed again how deeply divided we are. Demographic data shows white people overwhelmingly voted for the current president, and people of color overwhelmingly voted for his opponent. There is something, isn't there, about who we are, about our identity and experience, the amount of privilege we have in our lives that shapes the way that we see the world. It makes me wonder, about the foolish and wise bridesmaids, about who gets called foolish or wise. It makes me think, for example, of that documentary clip that we watched about redlining during one of our Lent series. Do you remember that? It was talking about the servicemen coming home from World War II and the help they got from the GI Bill to buy a first home. Now, the GI Bill applied equally to all who served, and yet for African American veterans, the struggle was in finding a home that they were allowed to buy. As white veterans bought their homes in white suburbs with the help of the GI Bill and enjoyed the way their homes' values increased over time, Black veterans were forced to buy in neighborhoods where white flight drove their home values down and down and down. Now, decades later, we regard those white grandfathers who returned from the war and purchased homes in white neighborhoods that would accumulate assets for their families as wise. And we regard those Black grandfathers who returned from the war and purchased homes that were set up from the start to devalue in increasingly poor neighborhoods as foolish. When Jesus tells this parable, here's what it provokes in me. I wonder why the foolish bridesmaids didn't bring any oil with them. Were they just ditzes, or were they from poorer families who couldn't spare the extra? Did they have to use all their extra resources on the clothes and gifts they needed for the wedding with nothing to have left over for the oil that they really didn't expect to need? And why didn't the wise bridesmaids care about them? Surely 2 bridesmaids could share 1 lamp, right? When they refused to share their oil, did they really know there wasn't enough, or were they just judging the other bridesmaids for failing in their personal responsibility? Were they really only interested in themselves? And why, seriously, why, when the foolish bridesmaids arrived at the wedding banquet, did the wise ones not rush to the door, relieved that their friends were okay, and remind the bridegroom who they were? You know, there are ways in which our country has fallen asleep, in which those who have always made it into the wedding and banquet on time, white people or wealthy people, those who have always had some extra oil, those who truly believe there's not enough for themselves and for us, are so asleep to the lived realities of our Black, Indigenous, and people of color siblings that we have sent them out in the middle of the night and shut the door to the banquet and blamed them for what happened. But what might happen? What might have happened if those 10 young women, some with plenty, others with not enough, had known the moral of Jesus' parable and had kept one another awake while they waited? Maybe they would have talked to each other, sharing the stories about their lives. Maybe they would have come to understand some of the complicated and systemic reasons why some of them had extra oil or didn't, instead of just judging and labeling each other. Maybe they would have come to care for one another so that when the bridegroom arrived, they would have been happy to share what they had left, or so that when the bridegroom arrived, he would have found them already throwing their own party outside of the walls of his estate. I think this is a parable about waiting. When the disciples ask Jesus to tell them when the world will end and how they will know, this is how he answers them. And in a way, I think he's saying the important question is not when, but what do we do in the meantime? Remember the stories that Jesus tells right after this one. One's about how we share and spend our money, how we balance our fear and faithfulness. The other is about who we care for, the poor, hungry, naked, sick, and imprisoned. When Jesus says, keep awake, this is all what he's talking about. We cannot let celebration or anger lull us into a hateful sleep. We must keep awake, awakening our curiosity about people who are different from us, awakening to the reality that there is plenty if we are willing to share, awakening our confidence that we are, each and every one of us, beloved children of God, no matter who has called us wise or foolish. There are real ways in which who is president matters, especially in the lives of those who are most marginalized. And still, there is so much that we are waiting for. As I said on the same weekend in 2016, America is never going to be the thing that saves us. Just like one bridegroom arriving late at night, one man at the top of a ticket cannot overcome the divides between us, cannot build God's kingdom of beloved community here on earth. Only God can do that, and only if we keep awake. May it be so.